This is actually the first podcast I'm actually doing on fish.
Oh,
So
wow.
like fish has been my obsession since a little kid.
Yeah.
And I don't know why I've left it so long to talk about my favourite subject
Yeah.
on fish.
Wow.
So
Well, hopefully I can do it justice.
I think you will. Yeah. No, well, it's also a very interesting topic about decommissioning oil or offshore rigs into artificial reefs.
This production was recorded at the podcast studios in the Media Arts Centre at Murdoch University. The views and opinions expressed in this podcast are solely those of the hosts and guests and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of Murdoch University. Any content provided by the hosts and guests are their personal opinions and are not intended to represent the views or opinions of the university, its administration, faculty, or staff. Now we have that out of the way, let's talk science. Paramount importance.
What is an offshore gas infrastructure rig, and how did you end up studying these unique ecosystems?
Yeah, so there's a lot of variation in the type of rigs because of where they can be placed. So they can be right on the coast, they can be up to 400 kilometers offshore in waters up to 3,000 meters deep. So there's a huge range in the type of structure, obviously, for those different applications. Most of the ones we know about are the steel jacket structures. So it's a whole lot of steel beams, kind of cross beams and stuff, very complex structure. And then there are a lot of concrete structures as well, especially in the places like the North Sea. And we have a few of those in Australia as well, where it's effectively this massive concrete base, which can be 50 meters long, with legs coming up that are also concrete from that then supports all the infrastructure you see above the water. So kind of like icebergs, the biggest part of the structure is actually below the surface.
Yeah, right. Even the 3,000 meter ones, are they more of a floating one or are they actually like a structure all the way to the bottom?
Yeah, so those are generally moored in some way in that kind of depth. So it's not necessarily that the whole structure goes down, but you will have like the shaft of the platform going down to the bottom as well to the wells.
Right. Okay. So what is the decommissioning side of it?
So decommissioning is basically when any infrastructure reaches the end of its life, it goes through a process of decommissioning. And for oil and gas, that's when they stop producing or they're no longer profitable. So they want to stop that structure's life at that point. And in most cases, that just means removing everything from the environment. So plugging the wells where the oil's coming out of and removing all the rest of the structures, the pipelines and the whole platform as well.
Right. So when they go through that, they're plugging the wells and all that, are they leaving those there? So what is exactly left behind? Is it those steel structures or is it just those concrete blocks coming up?
So it depends on the platform as well. So the wellhead is effectively where the oil's pumped out of. So the shafts that go underground come up to a wellhead, and those are generally left in place, but they're sealed so that there's no oil that can come out of that anymore. But then the structure we know as the oil rig or the oil platform, that whole structure is generally removed.
Right. Okay. How many of these like oil rigs and all that are off the coast of WA?
So in WA, it's really hard to get an exact number. The government doesn't, and this is worldwide, the governments really don't like putting exact numbers on it or locations because of national security threats and terrorism and things like that. They're over 50 in WA, and most of them are kind of between Exmouth and Port Hedland. So that's the Northwest Shelf is the main oil and gas producing area in WA.
Right. Oh, okay. When decommissioning them, is there a certain like type that can be decommissioned to an artificial reef? And is there like certain depths that they need to be in, or like what's the process that goes through that?
Yeah, so any structure can really be an artificial reef. So the type of structure doesn't matter. The first artificial reefs were, army planes or cars or even just bunches of tires that are put in the sea to increase fish habitat and increase fishing potential of that area. So the first oil platforms in the Gulf of Mexico were decommissioned to enhance fishing in the late 70s, early 80s. So any sort of structure can be decommissioned. International regulations, the most commonly cited one is that you should have 50 meters of water for navigation. So decommissioning 50 meters below the surface so that ships can still navigate through that area. But in some regions, there are exemptions to that. So the Gulf of Mexico, for example, you can leave platforms standing as an artificial reef. So it's a designated reef. It's marked on charts as a reef as well.
Right.
And then in terms of the decommissioning process, there are really 4 types of decommissioning. So the first one, as I said, is just remove everything from the seabed. So that's complete removal. And then if it is allowed to be left in place through what we call rigs to reefs programs, then it can either be left standing as is. So the bit on top where all the accommodation facilities and all the production facilities are, that's generally removed or reefed next to the platform. And then the rest of it's either left standing or cut at 50 meters below the surface, or the whole structure can effectively be toppled over so that it's lying flat on the seabed. So again, for navigation. And then you've still got that reef structure there. And then finally, in some places, they actually tow that whole structure. They remove it from the seabed and tow it to another location for the specific purpose of forming an artificial reef. So, for example, they might tow it a bit shallower where it's more accessible for recreational fishing and diving.
Right. Do they do that because they can't reuse the materials and it's too expensive to take out?
Yeah, it is really expensive to take out. Costs vary, but to give you an idea, so the decommissioning industry in Australia is expected to be worth $60 billion over the next 50 years.
A decommissioning industry, how does that work?
So basically that's everything that's needed to decommission the platform. So all the kind of the environmental surveys that need to be done, the vessels that are needed to actually take these massive structures out of the ocean, the divers that are needed potentially to cut the structures at a certain depth. Mm-hmm. All of that needs to happen is really expensive. So that's why we have these alternatives in place as well.
Right. And the cost is obviously cut down a lot by doing that. Is there a rough estimate of like turning them into, because would there be a plus side of it as well? Like if you turn it to a reef, you're going to enhance fishing. So then like you start getting positive or net impacts as well, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. So what we do, we don't really put a monetary value on it as much, but we try and do what is called a net environmental benefit analysis. So that's effectively, and focusing on the environmental side, because that's what I do. We weigh up all the environmental benefits of all the different scenarios versus all the environmental, impacts of all those scenarios. So for example, complete removal, we'll look at what are the environmental benefits to that in terms of kind of returning the ecosystem to what it was before the platform was put in place, the limit on invasive species or pollution or things like that, versus what are the impacts. So you're removing this huge structure, which has been an artificial reef for the entire lifetime that it's been there. Because we talk about rigs to reefs and turning platforms into reefs, but they effectively are actually functioning as reefs for the entire lifespan. Because as soon as they're put in place, fish arrive within hours of a new platform being put in place because it's new habitat.
Oh, within hours?
Yeah.
Wow. Have you looked at that, or is that?
No, I haven't, because there aren't a lot of new structures in WA especially. But people I've worked with in the North Sea have characterized kind of the first wave of colonization of a new platform when it's put in place. Yeah, and it happens really quickly.
There'll be like pelagic fishes, obviously, I guess.
Yeah,
but.
Yeah, absolutely. And you'll see that if you go off the coast, if there's anything floating, a log or something, or the fads, that's a perfect example. They're just like any sort of structure in the ocean.
Yeah, right. That's cool. I didn't realize it's that immediate.
Yeah.
Yeah. So like you've just mentioned that there's a huge diversity of species, whether it's fish, sponges, algae, crustaceans, anything that straight away starts going onto these reefs. How do they compare to more the natural reefs?
Yeah, so if I can take a bit of a step back to kind of the whole study that I was doing in WA, because we were looking at that comparison, but we really wanted to see, firstly, how a platform compares with a natural reef. But we were in an area where there are not a lot of natural reefs. It's mainly sandy bottom up there, lots of sponges and soft coral as the habitat rather than reefs themselves. So there has been a lot of work being done in the Gulf of Mexico on reefs versus platforms. So we did that comparison and we found that abundance of fish was around the same. Diversity was a bit higher at the platform in terms of demersal fish, bottom fish at the platform than at the reef. So diversity was a bit higher. But also the species assemblage was slightly different. So we're seeing different species at the platform at this artificial reef than we are at a natural reef, which I thought was really interesting.
What species?
So it's kind of the reef-associated species. So we were seeing the commercially important species at both, but higher abundance at the platform. So things like Rankin cod, red emperor, which are really the most caught commercially species up there and the indicator species for that fishery. But then also a lot of the small, really kind of localized reef species like damsels and the really small fish, we're seeing more at the platform as well. Because you've got this 3D structure, right? It's not just a reef kind of close to the sea floor. It extends all the way to the surface. So that creates a lot more vertical habitat for species as well.
So what was the kind of reef that you're comparing it to?
So we had a rocky reef nearby. It was really hard to actually find a reef that was around the same seabed footprint in that area because, as I said, there's not much. But that reef rose from the bottom at 50 meters to about 20 meters below the surface, so a 30-meter high reef, which is quite large. But the platform extends from the bottom at 50 meters all the way through to the surface with these legs, these 4 legs that are 11 meters in diameter. So that's a huge structure, and that provides habitat the whole way up.
When you're comparing to a natural reef, is there a way to look at the variables of like fishing impact on these reefs? Like if no one was fishing it, then these reefs would have a higher like abundance of those commercially fished species?
Yeah, potentially. So the commercial trawlers can't obviously operate over a reef because it is a bit of an obstacle. And that's one of the benefits, I guess, of the platforms as well, as you can't trawl around them. And in most countries, there's this exclusion zone around the platform, which is in Australia, it's 500 meters, where only authorized vessels are allowed within that. So there's no recreational fishing or commercial fishing from vessels.
Even on the decommissioned or just during the active rigs?
Yeah, just while they're active.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, because they would be there roughly how many years before they become decommissioned? What's their life?
Anywhere from 30 to 50 years.
Okay.
So it's a really long time.
Yeah, it is a long time.
Yeah, and they're protected for that time as well. So it's like a de facto marine protected area, essentially.
Right.
Yeah. But
are they acting like a fish aggravation device? Like are they bringing the fish around them or are they actually enhancing habitat and potentially increasing the abundance of fish?
Yeah, that attraction versus production debate is really hard to tease apart for the reef-associated species in particular. So we've had, in terms of the pelagic species, there's definitely that attraction effect because they're highly mobile. So they see that structure, they come to that structure. We can't show if they spend all their time there or how much of their time they spend there. But other studies from our work and other studies have shown that you get the full kind of life history stages of these species at each location. So at the platform, we'll see kind of juveniles, you'll see mature females and terminal males of reef-associated species, which is an indication that there's production happening there. There's the full life cycle of the fish happening at that location. And the way they can also show that is they look at the home range of these species. So if the home range of the species is less than 100 meters or 500 meters and there isn't another reef within that area, chances are those fish are actually being they're breeding at that location and recruiting at that location.
That's interesting. Yeah. I do like that you do see all the stages that it's enhancing habitat and yeah. So I'm sort of just turning on my fishing brain going like, oh, that's actually great. I always thought like these other artificial reefs are sort of acting as fads and they're just bringing all the fish around and then, for fishermen, it's just like, oh, there's a target. Go to them.
And that is a risk, especially where you can fish around an artificial reef because it can draw fish from other reefs nearby and then concentrate them in one place. But the platforms, I guess the attraction versus production doesn't really matter while it's active because it's still protected. So even if they are just being attracted there, they're protected from fishing while they're there.
Yeah, that's cool. Is there like a particular species you've been surprised to see on these reefs?
I think we've got like semi-resident megafauna at some of the platforms. So for example, there's a flatback turtle at the platform I work at that's just there all the time.
Oh, really?
They know it's there every day. We see dolphins every single day, even though we're in this kind of isolated location. But they just seem to spend a lot of time there.
Do they create like upwelling and like change the oceanography currents and all that?
Yeah, I haven't looked at that myself, but there is evidence that they do change currents to an extent. Which is something that, and also there is warm water that's produced from the platform. When I say warm water, it's kind of a few degrees warmer than the surrounding water temperature. But just as part of the process of kind of extracting the oil and refining that, there's seawater that's released from that. And the animals love that. The sharks spend a lot of time in that warmer water, especially.
Right.
Which is really interesting, yeah.
That is interesting. These are just the active ones though, not... Yeah. Okay. Well, so because of these acting as like... you're changing the geographical boundary, right? So a lot of when species have moved down the coastline or up the coastline, they're pretty much isolated, right? And now they're these like atolls or little coral reefs that they can move around. Does that changing the species ranges of like, especially when you talked about invasive species or like introduced species, do you see much of that happening with these like reefs?
We don't in WA, I think because we don't have a lot of platforms and they're not really close to each other. So that connectivity is not as high. And here we also have the Lewin Current flowing down the coast, which, as we know, brings tropical species all the way to Perth anyway. But what has been found in North and South America is invasive species. There's a soft coral called Tubastria, or the sun coral, which is actually native to Australia. And the sun coral it prefers artificial structures for some reason. So it prefers like a harbor wall or an oil platform to a natural reef structure. And they've used oil platforms in particular and the vessels supporting those platforms as a vector to move all the way down. They're in the Gulf of Mexico, they're in parts of the Caribbean, they're through most of Brazil's coast as well, where they're on a lot of the oil platforms in really high densities, and then they're invading natural reefs from there as well. So it is definitely a risk. And when they invade those natural reefs, they tend to just take over and dominate.
Right.
Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, we're like ship ballast do transport a lot. We've seen fish come from South Australia or Victoria and move along the coastline, like the Great Australian Bight. And we've seen like gobies and all that come through here. You don't see it anywhere else, but you see it Victoria and then in Perth.
Yeah.
And that's all come from that. And they're like the associated species that, live off the platforms on harbours and all that, and they've just been sucked up and transported.
Yeah, absolutely.
Around.
That's a big risk as well, because a lot of those vessels are going out to the platforms. So you've got the support vessels if there's any kind of environmental work being done or taking the crew out to the platform. But then a lot of the platforms, the oil's taken directly from the platform onto a tanker and then to wherever it's going. So you've got these large like cross-oceanic voyages happening directly to the platform. So there is that risk of that connectivity and that spread of species from that.
Yeah. So let's go down into the projects that you've been working on out there. So you're looking at, I didn't know you were looking at live rigs as well as decommissioned ones.
Yeah, so I haven't looked at decommissioned rigs myself because we just don't have any in WA.
Oh,
so
we don't?
We haven't had any large-scale rigs to reefs projects yet. So there have been small structures that have been decommissioned and there have been exemptions to leave some in place. There's a project going on now where they propose doing that in the Bass Strait with some large platforms off Victoria's coast, where they're planning on cutting them at 50 meters below the surface. But we haven't had any major platforms that have been left in place here yet. So that's why we're kind of trying to get ahead of it and have the ecological research first to then support that.
Right. Okay. And is there like a risk of like the degrading of because they're made out of steel and all that? Is there a risk of like what's leaching into the environment from that, or when they're like degrading down?
Yeah, I haven't looked at that myself. I think the risk is more the structural integrity. So if you had to leave that structure standing and it's a steel structure, at what point is there a risk of that collapsing? And then who's responsible in terms of the public liability of that? Because obviously it's not the company anymore if that happens in 100 years' time. And it's who's liable for any damage that is done or what happens to that structure. The concrete structures, they say maybe hundreds of years that those could last for. So that definitely affects the type of decommissioning. There have been studies looking at plastics, so especially on the pipelines, because they tend to have plastic around them, and how that breaks down over time if that pipeline had to be left. And the studies that I've seen have shown that the plastics don't necessarily accumulate in one area because it deteriorates slowly over time with the currents that kind of get spread over a big area, which is obviously not great, but it's better than it sitting in one area and then accumulating in those fish in that location.
Yeah. You mentioned at the start about tire reefs, and there was a study, was it Mexico? Do you know the one that, and they started like for the first like 5-10 years or something, it was like great. And then they started breaking down and then, Do you know much more about that? Because I'm like only grasping at a couple memories, but.
Yeah, well, I think initially they just kind of put whatever they had access to into the ocean to create reefs. Because anything will create a reef, but it's not necessarily going to be a long-lasting reef. So that's an issue that they're facing with shipwrecks, especially in the Pacific now. So a lot of the World War II shipwrecks are starting to break down, and there's the risk that those will start leaking oil or the fuel that they had. So it's the same type of thing. A lot of these things can break down over time, but because we're doing this with more purpose than a lot of those cases and a lot more research, we can make better decisions on how that structure is decommissioned. Maybe if it's going to break down in 100 years, you have it lying down instead, so it's not going to be this massive collapse.
Yeah. Can they just go suck the oil and like fuel out of these ships?
Yeah, absolutely. There's actually a group based in Australia that's doing that called the Major Projects Foundation.
Okay.
And they're going around to a lot of these shipwrecks and surveying them and kind of monitoring the risk of them breaking down. And then they have a plan to suck the oil out if need be. But again, it's who pays for that.
Yeah.
So whose responsibility are those shipwrecks?
Can they reuse it, or is it too old by that stage?
Probably, yeah. I mean, we're looking at maybe 80-year-old oil now. Yeah.
So how do you go about researching these? So you're going out there on a boat and you're dropping stereo bruvs, which is, I'll let you explain what stereo bruv is actually.
So basically, before I get into what bruvs are, the goal for me was to look at, if we're going to decommission this platform, what would complete removal look like, right? So if we had to remove it, what did that environment look like before the rig was installed? So what would it look like afterwards as well? So we can't go back in time, but we found a site that looked similar to the conditions of where the rig was installed. So really flat, sandy bottom, no hard structure, because that's what they were looking for when it was installed as well. And we found that there's been such a big change to that ecosystem from installing the rig. The community's moved from sand-associated species, really low abundance, to this really high diversity and abundance of reef-associated species. And the big reason for that, apart from the rig itself, and when we get onto the bruvs, we couldn't deploy the bruvs close to the platform itself because you don't want to drop them on a pipeline or something like that. So we were 50 meters away, and even out to 500 meters away, we saw a huge recovery of the seabed communities. So that habitat, those sponges and soft corals, had really recovered from decades of trawling in that area, whereas the other site we were looking at hadn't had that recovery. And there's still trawling that goes on there, but it hadn't recovered from those really intensive impacts 30 years ago. So that was really encouraging to see how it affects the surrounding area, not just the platform itself.
Yeah. Yeah. Could they act as like a coral reef? Like if we keep going these heat waves, we're going to potentially lose coral reefs. Do you see those associated species? So there's reef associated species and there's coral reefs associated species. Yeah. And does coral grow on these structures?
Yes, it does. A lot of our research was a lot deeper. So you're looking more at the soft corals and things like that, but you do get corals growing on the platform structure itself. It's really different because it's a vertical structure. So what you get growing near the surface where there's more light would be different from what you've got right down at the bottom of the structure as well.
Right.
But yeah, that could potentially help in that case as well. And it's something we need to consider with reefing them and where we reef them as well. You know, do we need new reefs closer to the coast, maybe in shallower water instead?
Yeah. Interesting. What about, so you said you're dropping the cameras 50 meters away. Do you not get any cameras like where the pylons reach the bottom or anything like that? Or
so for that, we use ROV surveys, so remotely operated vehicles.
Okay. Right.
And the nice thing is the oil companies are doing that anyway for inspections and maintenance. And we can utilize that footage for our ecological surveys of what's going on the structure. And then the bruvs were a bit further away because that's something we can then replicate at the natural reef and at the other sites that we study. So a bit about the bruvs then is they effectively bruvs are just a camera and some bait. Right.
Yeah,
and
the cameras underwater video.
Yeah, exactly. And you're watching what comes up to the bait. So the stereo cameras allow us to also measure the fish because those two cameras are calibrated. So we can measure the fish and we can calculate the weight of each fish from that, which allows us to then work out the biomass at a location.
And that's how you quantified the adults and females, males, all that. So so you said you've seen them from all stages of life. Are these demersal commercially fished species, or are they just like reef associated? What were the
both? So we've seen juveniles of some of the snappers there. We've seen juvenile tiger sharks there, less than 70 centimeters, so really young. But a range of species, juvenile red emperor as well. So there's a huge range of commercially important reef-associated species, sharks as well.
Is the outcome looking like it's better to keep the reef there because it's had such a long time to develop and grow and increase the productivity than taking it all out, going back to that bare substrate, which I guess like sandy bottoms are, they're not depauperate, they're full of life in there. There's so many, especially invertebrates that live in the sand environments. But there's also a lot of sand compared to reef. So
What we found is there's absolutely value in leaving them there because you've got this really highly diverse reef community, but it's also an area where there isn't a lot of, as you say, there's a lot of sand. There isn't a lot of reef in that area. So the Northwest Shelf is very sandy, and it was in the 60s, I guess, dominated by sponges and soft corals and all those kind of structures which add the complexity to that habitat. But that was all removed through fishing. Large parts of the Northwest Shelf were really heavily trawled through the 70s and 80s. So a lot of what was there has been removed. So in this case, it's not like we're returning it to what it was. If we remove the platform, we're returning it to what it was after fishing impacts. So it's different from what it would have been before, essentially. And that's where we looked at this concept called novel ecosystems, which is more of a terrestrial concept for where humans have altered an ecosystem and it can't be restored to its historical state.
Alternative stable states?
Yeah. That is essentially that kind of concept where there's a reason why we don't want to or can't return it to what it was before. And ecological reasons are one of the considerations there, where we can say there's an ecological reason to keep it as it is now instead of trying to completely restore that area to what it was.
Right. Interesting. What happens, I'm going to go back to the brub footage. So what happens when you collect it? So you get a number of reps of it, so multiple sites, and then you watch the footage, you analyze it. What happens next with all this data? And also, why is it important to collect like the size of the fish?
Yeah.
And weight?
So for the brubs, we deploy a lot of brubs, as you say, to have that replication. We'll deploy at least 50 at each of our sites. And we do that for over a period of years. So my PhD work was 3 years, 2 surveys a year to these sites. So we had a lot of video to watch at the end of that. And you watch all the video, you count and identify and measure all the fish that you see. And then that gives you that diversity, abundance, length, biomass. And what we're really looking at is the nice thing with brubs, it gives you a snapshot in time of a location. And you can use that snapshot to benchmark that location and then either look at that location itself through time or compare that location with other locations, which are slightly different. So in my case, it was a natural reef versus this oil platform. You can look at inside and outside MPAs. You can look at where they want to protect an area, so where they want to create an MPA. You can do a study
Marine park.
Yes, so marine protected area. So where they want to have a marine protected area, you can use brubs to get a snapshot of what that area looks like and then assess it after the creation of the MPA to see how much of an effect that's had.
Right. And what would your gut feeling? Would you rather have these artificial reefs? If you were to choose between like an artificial reef, a decommissioned rig, or a natural reef, which one would be like ecologically more important to keep?
That's a really interesting question. I think protecting natural reefs is really important, and it's something we don't do enough of. So, and marine protected areas, MPAs, are the way to do that. So they're still open to fishing, the natural reefs in that area. We do have a lot of reefs that are protected, but these offshore reefs we're finding are very important. The ones that are a bit deeper as well, rather than, say, Ningaloo, which is really shallow. But the artificial reefs are different from the natural reefs. So it's not necessarily that they're better, but the species found there are slightly different. And we get, I guess, more of a mix of those sand-associated and reef-associated species than we do at the natural reef. And we've got this really tall vertical structure, which is really different because it's 50 meters high. So what we found going back to that ROV footage is the depths between, I think it was around 15 meters in the water column where you've got this hard structure is where we found a lot of juveniles and some of the smaller fish. So instead of looking across a horizontal reef, you suddenly have this different community vertically. And that's an important consideration that you don't have a natural reef. So that's why they're different. And that's something we need to consider with decommissioning as well.
Has there been any specific moments when you've gone, wow, I was not expecting that on these reefs? Like you would have seen so much footage.
Yeah, it's hundreds of hours of footage that we've seen. We've seen a lot of sea snakes diving to 50 meters, which is really interesting. And they'll come and investigate the camera and maybe just rest on the seafloor for a few minutes. But
Yeah.
that was incredible to see. And I've heard that they can dive that deep, but we can actually see them going down and hunting and in the crevices of the reef.
Oh, cool.
Which is
Because they
really
can
cool.
slowly absorb oxygen through the water, through their skin.
Yeah.
And they have a
Some species can, yeah.
yeah, and they have like a lung. And I don't think all snakes have lungs. It's only one, the sea snakes.
Yeah, I'm not sure how that works. but
One big lung.
yeah, so they hold their
Yeah.
breath essentially for
Yeah.
a long time to be able to go down that deep and then return to the surface again.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's incredible. And then something else that I actually was kind of a side paper in my PhD, but the nice thing with Bruv's footage is you're observing that ecosystem without humans in the water, without divers. So you see some novel behaviors as well. And we saw a cuttlefish that was mimicking a hermit crab. So it was actually walking across the sea floor. And we hypothesized that this was for protection because it's an area where there wasn't a lot of shelter. And it's the soft-bodied animal that's kind of mimicking a hard-bodied hermit crab that's in a shell.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Cool. I watched a lot of Bruvs. We did projects on the Bunbury, Dunsborough and Mandurah artificial reefs. And I was dropping Bruv cameras, not stereo Bruvs, just Bruv cameras out on them. And watching one of the videos on that, we had like an octopus come up to the bait and it was punching fish. Like, like for the whole video, it was just sitting there and like sort of sitting on the bait. And then just any fish that came to it, it would just throw out a leg and try and like punch it. And like it was, such
we've seen that before as well. It's such interesting behavior. And I don't know why they do it. They're just guarding the bait. Yeah. Which they often can't get to anyway.
No, it's such a cool, I don't know, I love octopuses. I think they're just amazing creatures.
Yeah, me too. And it's so cool to see their behavior in that kind of environment as well.
Yeah.
And how they interact with other animals.
Yeah. What about fish? Have there been some interesting behaviors of fish when you've been looking at these videos?
The color change has been really interesting. So a lot of fish can change color. So if we think about things like sailfish and how they can turn their colors on and off to communicate with each other when they're working around a bait ball. We looked at emperors and how emperors change color to signal to each other when they're coming into the bait on the Bruvs as well. And we'll just get they'll either go really dark or get these really strong stripes that aren't there in their kind of natural color state.
Yeah.
And it is communication.
Is that when they're going to feed or?
Yeah. So what we found is we had one of our master's students looking into this from locations across northwestern Australia. And it seems to be that when they're coming in to feed, they'll kind of signal to each other that that's what they're doing and they'll turn the stripes on. And you'll see some with stripes and some without around the bait as well.
Wow.
That was really interesting. It's something, and you need hundreds of hours of footage to be able to pick up whether that's a one-off or whether it's a pattern that you're seeing.
Yeah. That's so cool. That's like a form of communication that I've never heard of.
Yeah.
I'm sure people don't. Is it, and same with other fish as well?
Yeah, I don't know how many different species do it. For example, the red emperor, they can completely get rid of their stripes. So they've got these really strong kind of red stripes on a white body, and they can completely get rid of those stripes if they want to as well.
Yeah.
It's really interesting. The Rankin cod, which is dark with white spots, can completely go completely black as well and get rid of those spots if it wants to.
Right.
So yeah, it's really interesting to see that kind of, we don't know what they're doing with it a lot of the time as well. But the more footage we have and the more we can see these patterns on a larger scale, we can try and interpret it as best we can.
Yeah. Do you have a hypothesis to why the Rankins would just go completely black?
I don't know. One of the reasons is potentially camouflage with a lot of these species. So stripes are used to break up your body shape. So with the emperors, we thought that might be something else that they're doing, is they're using the stripes to kind of break up their body. It's something that cuttlefish and octopus do as well. They have those kind of mottled patterns to break up their body shape, but we don't know. And it would be really hard to do a lab experiment on it, or any sort of experiment because you don't know what the natural conditions are that are driving that behavior as well.
Yeah. Yeah, interesting. Has there been is there more, like, I have one story, but do you have more interesting behaviors that you've like seen on these from fish specifically, or?
Not that I can think of offhand. I'm interested in yours though.
Yeah. So my boss might kill me for this, for giving away the idea. We've got it in a written manuscript and then haven't quite published it yet. So one of the things I noticed when we were doing the artificial reefs is that they were acting as also like cleaner stations. There's no temperate reef cleaner stations documented. So,
oh wow,
because we just don't have cleaner fish down this far. There's like one species, but they're really quite rare. But juvenile Western king wrasse can act as cleaner fish. And so when I was watching all these Bruv footage on these artificial reefs, I've noticed like a lot of actually it wasn't just pelagic fish, but mainly it was pelagic fish come in, they'd swim and they would just go vertical like that.
Oh, wow.
And then these juvenile western king wrasse would come in and like, you know, clean them, go into their gills, clean their mouths and all that. And then so that was a behavior. And then I started looking further and watching, like once I started noticing that, I was like, okay, what's happening beforehand and all that. And the king wrasse would signal if they're going to clean up, because there's thousands and thousands of these fish on these reefs pretty much all the time. But and certain conditions, and so why would they just all of a sudden start cleaning? And they would go vertical beforehand. So that was like them signaling like, yeah, we're open for business kind of thing. And then they would come in. I saw eagle rays. Eagle rays would like come in, they would sit, and then they would put their wings right up in the air. And then the fish would come over.
Yeah, that's incredible. And I don't even know if anyone's looked at kind of signaling behavior on tropical cleaning stations either. That's so interesting.
That's the second paper.
Yeah.
So pressure's on now for my boss and I to get that paper.
Because a lot of the pelagic species use reefs to clean themselves that I've seen, and from what I've heard.
As in like scratching?
Yeah, like actual scraping behavior to remove parasites and that type of thing. So that's really interesting that they're actually fish that would do that for them as well.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. We actually had, it wasn't my work, it was someone else in our lab who looked at how tuna actually scrape on sharks. So they use the tail of the shark to remove parasites. So they
saw that paper.
It's so interesting. And that's again from just literally hundreds of hours of footage of pelagic bruvs. So we redeploy the bruvs just in the water column to look at pelagic species. And he saw this pattern where these tuna would just come up and time it right with the tail beat and scrape against the shark.
What did the shark do? Do you know?
They didn't seem to mind.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah. But I guess in an environment like that, you don't have an object to get rid of parasites or something.
No, that's true. I guess tunas don't stop swimming, right? So they can't just like go and sit there and
exactly
and get interesting. So I want to go back. Why do you collect the length and weight data? What's the purpose of having that kind of data for stereo bruvs? Or from stereo bruvs?
So the one aspect of it is the life history stages. So being able to really tell if something's an adult or a juvenile. Some species have kind of morphological differences. So they look different if they're an adult or a juvenile, but some don't. So that really helps us to be able to work out those life history stages. And then the other aspect is calculating biomass. So biomass is used to assess kind of the overall ecosystem. And what we see with marine protected areas is it's not just that you have more fish at a location, so higher abundance that's protected, but you have bigger fish as well. So it's really important that protection allows fish to grow bigger, not just have more fish. So if we're looking at protected areas versus unprotected areas, which in this case the oil platform's protected, the natural reef isn't, you want to look at that biomass to see if you've also got those bigger fish, which is an indicator of ecosystem health.
And that's what you were mentioning before? Yeah. Only of specific species? Like, are they?
Yeah, so that's the nice thing is we don't have to look at the whole ecosystem. We can look at just, for example, the commercially important species. We can just focus on those. And those were kind of the same between our natural reef and the platform, but the biomass was much higher at the platform than that sandy site, like that historical state pre-installation site.
What are the challenges of collecting the data from these reefs? Is it like, one, I guess, practical challenges, and we're assuming there'll be quite a bit of political challenges as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So the practical challenges, as I mentioned, with the bruvs not being able to get close to the structure itself. So actually being able to deploy the bruvs close to the platform is really difficult. And that we kind of overcame that with the ROV. But we also made sure that when we went to the natural reef, we deployed the bruvs 50 meters away from the natural reef so that we had a fair comparison between the two. And what we found, and there's evidence for this in other papers that we came across as well, is there's an ecological halo that forms around an artificial reef, and I guess a natural reef to an extent as well, where diversity and abundance is higher in the area surrounding the reef to a distance of, in our case, 500 meters than it is a few kilometers away. So that effect of having that reef there isn't just what's on the reef itself. It extends to a bigger area. There's like an overflow or a spillover effect to the habitat surrounding that reef.
And that's not the same on the natural reefs.
It can be, But again, it depends on the level of protection.
Yeah.
So a lot of the artificial reefs are protected from fishing.
And it's mainly because of also the vertical structure. Yeah.
So that includes, your seabed footprint might be the same size as the natural reef, but your 3D footprint to the surface is much higher. So your entire surface area of your reef is much bigger.
All this sounds very positive. Is there negative things about, like, what are the negative impacts or potential negative impacts?
Of kind of leaving them in place?
Yeah.
So I guess invasive species are the big one. So just having that stepping stone there, as you said, with climate change, we don't know how species are going to move, and this allows them to move offshore more. There is a lot of opposition because of the effects of trawling. So with the obstacles to trawling, rather, that this platform presents. So fisheries aren't too happy about leaving the platform there. There's also...
Even though they know it's like increasing the biomass and net productivity.
Exactly.
Catch-22, yeah.
There's also a lot of opposition because it can come across as it's just saving money for the oil companies.
Yeah.
So there have been cases in the past, in the North Sea in particular, where there have been kind of public campaigns and protests against leaving reefs in place. And I guess that comes back down to it needs to be done for the right reasons. So there need to be solid environmental and ecological reasons if we are going to leave these rigs in place. Because otherwise it can come across as just dumping something in the ocean, and that's not what we want to be doing.
No.
So it's teasing apart the reasons for the benefits for oil companies in terms of saving money, but there need to be those really strong ecological reasons. And that's why in my case, the oil company that we worked with initially for my PhD, they wanted it to be done through a university because then there's that independence of the research. It goes through peer review. And also the oil company had no input to the analyses we were doing or the papers we were writing. They were funding the research and giving us access to the oil field, which is one of those challenges as well of doing this research. But the research itself was not controlled by them. It was totally independent, and we could do what we wanted with the project from there. So that helps build that environmental and ecological assessment separate of the company itself.
Right. How do you go about the variables of the fish aggregating around these environments to a natural one? Like, you mentioned about it before, predation versus production kind of thing.
It's really tricky because, as I say, you don't know why those fish are there, especially the pelagic species, because they can move such big distances. So the natural reef and artificial reef that I studied are only about 15 kilometers apart, and most of the pelagic species can do that in a day easily. So they could be traveling between these locations. I think that's going to be a big factor with potentially leaving these structures in place, is thinking about how many of those fish, if the structure had to be removed, how much fish production are you losing versus pelagic species, which could potentially just move to another location. Whereas a lot of the reef-associated species on the structure itself would potentially be lost if there isn't another natural reef for them to go to in that area.
Is there reefs that are looking like they're going to be left in WA? Is that where we're looking like we're heading towards?
Yeah, I think so. So Australian policy is changing, and a lot of the companies are trying to get ahead of it and do these studies now so that they have the information that they need at the time of decommissioning. So the platform I've been focusing on, it's probably got another 10 years, but we've already been doing these studies to have all that ecological information over a long period of time to know what that area looks like before it's decommissioned.
What are the policies? Is there like a checklist or something? Or?
Yeah, because it's new in Australia, it's really difficult, and we don't have that precedent yet. So the base case in Australia is complete removal. So everything's removed from the seabed, and it's kind of rehabilitated as much as possible. But as I mentioned earlier, in the Bass Strait off Melbourne, there is a proposal now to leave some or parts of those structures in place, and those are massive platforms. I think there are about 10 that they're decommissioning at the moment, and cutting those at 50 meters. So the ones that are shallower than 50 meters will be removed, and the ones that are deeper than 50 meters will be, so some that are in 100 meters of water, for example, 50 meters of that structure will be left behind as an artificial reef.
Is there did you look at reefs at different depths? Like not within the vertical profile of one reef, but like in those reefs that, I guess you said they change from when they go from 100 meters to a few kilometers deep. Is it always that same positive impact with those deeper ones as well?
With the deeper ones, we see kind of a bigger range of species, especially what's growing on the platform. So in the North Sea, they see some cold water corals, endangered cold water corals growing on the platform as well. It's a lot harder to assess those deeper species. Some of the platforms up to 200 meters deep.
It's pretty much dark down there.
Yeah, exactly. But that is going to change what you see down there. There tends to be a little bit lower diversity at those depths as well, but definitely ecological value, especially in these areas like, as I mentioned, the Northwest Shelf, but the North Sea as well, where you've had a lot of human impact in those environments in the past already, historically. The North Sea has been trawled for decades. The Northwest Shelf has been trawled for decades. So these areas are already altered by human activity. And the platforms almost provide like an oasis of diversity. So that's something that needs to be considered if we want to get rid of those platforms.
Is there a material that performs better than other materials? Like, is concrete the best structure to have, or is it the steel beams is that like the best one? Or
I think it's more just about complexity. So materials do matter, I guess, in terms of the organisms that can adhere and settle. So corals, sponges, macroalgae, but more complex structures make better reefs. So if you look at coral reefs, highly complex coral reefs tend to have higher diversity and abundance of fish. So artificial reefs try to replicate that as much as possible. So I guess the question is, are there ways that we can, if we need to, enhance the oil platforms to make them more complex so that they function as better artificial reefs if they are decommissioned?
Right. How can your research shape like international policies, especially in like, as we talked about, the Gulf of Mexico and the North Sea and stuff?
Yeah, I've done some work with people in the North Sea and also on kind of synthesis working groups to look at what is the scientific consensus around decommissioning in the North Sea, which will impact policy. But we're also working with researchers in Brazil now, and their platforms are not as old as the ones in Australia, so they've got a bit more time before decommissioning. So their approach is, how can they learn kind of the lessons we've already learned here and in the Gulf of Mexico and in the North Sea without having to do it all from scratch and reinventing the wheel themselves. So what can they take in terms of for example, how do you process ROV footage from industry? Rather than having groups figuring that out again, which has already been done, they can just use what are the procedures that are already in place. And then also, what have we found in terms of the ecological benefits that they can apply there to similar, tropical locations, rather than going and doing all the studies themselves?
Is your ROV footage quantitative?
It's difficult, because the studies aren't necessarily conducted in a standardized manner. There are actually protocols internationally that researchers at UWA and AIMS have worked on, where it's how do you do a standardized ROV transect when you're doing kind of maintenance and inspections. So things like, if you're going to have the lights on, make sure you keep the lights on for the whole transect. You maintain a constant speed, because a lot of ROV operators, when they're doing these inspections, will stop on a certain object, or they'll see something interesting and turn towards that. And when you're doing a transect, that's really difficult.
Bias and
exactly. What we've done is we've broken it down into stills, so using frames. So when we're doing it by depth, we'll pick a depth of, say, 0 to 5 meters and randomly pick 10 still frames within that depth range and then analyze those.
It's kind of like, I can't remember what it's called when they do the coral CPU thing.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And we've used that software for some of it as well. When we were looking at the invasive species, the sun corals, we used the coral point count for that as well.
Yeah. Have you used any of the AI?
No, not yet. I would love to. I think there are a lot of benefits, especially with brubs where we have a lot of footage. Pelagic brubs in particular, you tend to watch a lot of blue water. So we don't have to watch them at real-time speed. We can watch them a bit faster. But essentially something that could just tell us there's an object there, and then we can go and identify that object rather than watching the whole video. Yeah.
So I have a friend who's been developing an AI for a while, and I've been helping him on that in terms of just helping him in terms of he uses the AI to identify that object, like a fish, and then I'll ID the fish, and then the computer learns what that fish shape is and colors, patterns, and all that, and then you're like constantly teaching and building up that database. And we've tried quantitative comparing it against like above footage that I've watched the footage and ID'd everything, and I actually can't remember how well it performed against that. It got quite complicated when there was like on Reef, because there's obviously you only get like portions of the fish and all that, and if you know what you're looking for, you know what it is. But definitely looks like it could help in that way, because that turned, as you said, you've got 100 videos of an hour footage, that's 100 hours.
Yeah.
Which can be turned into 10 minutes.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
The other risk with AI, and something, because it's going to happen at some stage and something we'll have to deal with, is those behaviors that I was talking about. That's where you need a human watching the video, because it's not just acknowledging that that's something that's not normal for that species. It's seeing, is this something that's just a one-off, or is this something we're seeing across different locations? So I think that human kind of approach and involvement will always be important for stuff like that. But again, it's much quicker to watch those videos just for behavior, for example, or for quality control for the AI, if you're not having to stop and identify and count every fish as well.
Going back to the ROVs, were you worried that they were scaring away the fish as well?
Yeah, that's definitely a consideration. And we haven't done direct quantitative comparisons with our bruvs because of that.
Yeah.
Because it's a different factor, because they are quite loud. And it's not necessarily just scaring the fish. Some fish are just attracted to them. Yeah. They see this thing with lights that's moving around and they want to come and have a look.
They were like the more dominant species on the reef, right?
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So that it is a consideration, but it's also a consideration with diver surveys, for example, or underwater visual sensors, where you have a human in the water, and that definitely affects what you're seeing. So from what I can remember on diver surveys compared with bruvs again, diver surveys, you're less likely to see some of the bigger predators, whereas bruvs, because you have the bait, you're more likely to see those bigger predators more than the small gobies and things that are living in the reef. So there are pros and cons to those different methods, and it's about just, if you are going to compare them, acknowledging that and finding out how you deal with that.
Have you had a chance to go in a submarine onto one of these?
No, not yet.
Not yet.
I'd love to. That's how they do most of the research in California.
Oh, really?
Is they go down in submarines and just count all the fish that they're seeing, which would be incredible.
Yeah, that's one of my life goals.
Yeah.
Is to go to a submarine.
Be amazing.
Yeah, yeah. Surely, like I've seen some of the submarines like in WA. Have they never, like mining companies, never thought to put one down? Or
I think the thing is they try and limit human involvement in the water as much as possible, just from health and safety, and it's expensive as well. And just all the paperwork to even have divers in the water is hard.
Have you dived on them?
No. Because we try and keep our method the same.
Yeah.
So for us, it's about, we're standardized with bruvs, and that means we can do it across a whole lot of different environments, and it's standardized the same way. So that means we can do regional comparisons. If we could go and do the same thing in Brazil or the North Sea with bruvs, and then compare platforms across locations.
In terms of just like learning and trying to understand it, do you think that would be valuable to jump in and actually like visually see, and like, because then you can go right up close to actually see these structures? And do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. There is value in that. And there's a lot of work being done. I think in the Gulf of Mexico, they do a lot of diving on the platforms. But what it goes back to for me is just kind of that understanding of the environment and just looking at the environment. There's a lot of value in local knowledge as well. So not as much in this case, but it's the same type of thing of just people who know that area, who spend a lot of time there, who know what it should look, and just that broader approach. So whether that's recreational fishers, whether that's divers, whether that's local communities or indigenous communities, that is really important with all the type of research that we do.
Has there been any range extensions or new species that you found with doing all these stereo bruvs or ROVs on these reefs?
Not in terms of the platforms that we found. We do find species that are kind of maybe a little bit outside their depth range, because you do have this vertical structure, which means they can move a little bit deeper than they would. But in other regions, they've definitely found species that are just kind of where they shouldn't be, because there's a structure there. And as you say, it's a bit of a stepping stone out to the middle of nowhere. We also see a lot of aggregations in other regions. So in Qatar, they've had whale sharks aggregating around the platforms, potentially because of that upwelling that we mentioned. In the North Sea, they've had poor beagle sharks aggregating around the platforms. They don't know why, but suddenly you'll see a whole lot of sharks around the platform.
Beagle sharks?
Poor beagle sharks. It's like a mako.
The ones, they're smaller with big eyes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Oliver Jewell brought that up.
Yes, right.
I think I interviewed him again last week.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
He's the shark guy.
Yeah. It was very interesting. I knew him at Murdoch.
Yeah. Oh, okay.
Yeah, we weren't in the same lab, but he was doing his PhD when I started working here.
Right.
And so I've known him for quite a few years. And I did also a podcast with him about great whites.
Yeah.
But yeah. So I can imagine some of these field trips you've been to so many cool places. Has there been some moments where you've been like, this is amazing? What is like the peak? And has there been some like real bad troughs, bad moments as well?
I guess start with the bad moments. During a PhD, anything that doesn't go right feels like it's the end of the world.
Yes.
Right. So if your data collection doesn't work properly, my first trip, we had some bruvs. We weren't expecting such big tide ranges, and some of them started tipping over, which is something we could deal with easily in the field, just putting more weight on them. But initially, you have that panic of what happens if I just don't get any data from this. So that was challenging. The weather up there is always a challenge in northwestern WA.
Cyclones and
just the wind, coming off the desert, such a big fetch. So that makes it a little bit tricky. But over time, we've been doing this for almost 10 years now. We've kind of managed to just pick the right times. Neap tides, we know the best times a year to go. In terms of the good moments, I think just being out on a boat for a week at a time and seeing whales off that area during the migration in September. And then also
do they interact with the reef?
They tend to spend a fair bit of time around the rig itself. I don't know if it's because of that warm water, but they'll swim right up to it. The noise from the platform doesn't bother them at all. So we'll see like a mother and calf just swim directly underneath the platform.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, they spend a lot of time around there, but I don't know why at this stage.
Yeah.
They found similar things in the North Sea as well, where the whales and dolphins tend to spend a lot of time around the platforms.
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah. And then we had it was kind of Rigs to Reefs as well project in Thailand. So they've got a Rigs to Reefs program now, and they've decommissioned a few platforms where they've towed them to one place to create an artificial reef. And just in general, going to such a different place. And we're working off local fishing boats with a PhD student at UWA who's actually from Thailand, but working with local fishers there, being based on the islands and just seeing kind of that local impact rather than what I do most of the time, which is working with industry.
Have you gone to many other places outside of like WA? You just mentioned Thailand and stuff, but looked at these other reefs, or has it just sort of been?
Yeah, we're trying to expand and do more of that. The collaboration we have with Brazil, we're hoping to start doing bruvs over there as well. But our work in general is kind of global.
Yeah.
So we're hoping to do more of the oil platform work off the back of that.
If you were like with a gut feeling, do you think in areas of the world where there's been high commercial impact of fisheries, do you think they can bring back, like, are they so important that they could bring back production?
Yeah, I think so.
Really?
Especially somewhere like the North Sea where there's so many platforms.
You need a large amount, I would imagine, right?
Yeah. But there's also restoration work going on in these places. So they're big projects mainly run by the Nature Conservancy in the North Sea, looking at rebuilding the old oyster reefs that used to exist there.
Yeah.
So, and that's really the same thing, right? It's rebuilding a reef that was once there. And the oil platforms, it's not exactly the same type of reef, but it is building back that reef structure, which kind of encourages the fish that are associated with that structure that are less common there now. And those are generally the species that those fisheries initially targeted. So in Northwest WA, it was the emperor and snapper that they started targeting for that fishery. And within 15 to 20 years, what they were catching completely changed because there weren't as many of those species anymore. So it's what can we do to bring back healthy populations of those species?
What's the most abundant fish on these reefs?
That's really hard to tell.
Or maybe biomass.
Yeah.
Because like obviously you can get huge densities of really small fish.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we do see a lot of that. But I would say probably just trevallies. Huge schools of golden trevally and that's definitely a fad effect to an extent where they're just swimming around the platform constantly, but massive, massive schools on the seabed as well because it's a food source for them. So apart from shelter from predators, which is a big reason for fads, they're feeding on all the smaller fish that are found around the platform as well. But that's definitely the one that we see the most.
Right. Is there a species you would expect to see on them that you haven't?
Oh, that's a very good question. Not a species in particular that I can think of. As far as I can recall, there were some species on the natural reef that we didn't see at the platform. So kind of we would see most of the same families or all the same families. But for example, some of the species of emperor might have been at one and not the other. And it's really hard to work out why that would be the case because they're not too far apart.
Yeah.
But that's why you collect as much data as you can. Right?
Yeah.
And
do you collect like invertebrate samples and look at like the food webs?
no, we haven't done that yet. That's something that would be really interesting to add, especially directly around the platform.
Yeah.
And just get that really like top to bottom or bottom to top like picture of the whole food web.
In terms of like feeding guilds on these structures, is it like mainly piscivorous fish or is there like a mixture? I can't imagine there'll be any detritivores on there, but like herbivores and
Yeah,
and
there's quite a good mix. Again, with brubs, we do see more of the predators, but in the reef environments, you do see everything that's there. Essentially, it's not like they move away
yeah.
because the brubs are there. But yeah, we do see quite a lot of herbivores as well.
Right. Is there like compared though to the natural reefs?
Yeah,
Is
we
there like
didn't.
a higher?
Yeah, we didn't go into that in a lot of detail, looking at trophic levels, but the diversity was kind of similar across those two sites. The differences in species assemblages were driven by some of the bigger animals, so some of the shark species that we're seeing at one and not the other.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And do you think that's just because of the warm water or?
I think that's definitely part of it, but I think it's...
Because that warm water wouldn't be there once they get decommissioned.
Yeah, exactly.
Right?
But I think the main thing is just the food source. Because we're seeing more fish, especially because we weren't looking at the platform itself. The abundance of fish on the platform, which what we've seen with the ROV, is much higher than what we're seeing on the bruvs. So looking at what's really on that structure, there's a much bigger food source for these species on the platform. So that's why we see a lot of the big predators there. And those can move to the natural reef as well. So that's why it becomes really hard to tease apart where they're spending the majority of their time. Tagging would be the way to do that, and find where they're spending most of their time.
Interesting. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
This has been, awesome. It's been such an interesting topic to learn about. I didn't have much knowledge at all about it. So, and I didn't know that we didn't have any reefs at the moment, but is there one relatively soon in WA?
I think they will start happening really soon because they're getting to that age now where they need to be decommissioned. So this is going to start happening. Companies might decide to just remove them instead because, as I say, there's not an explicit allowance for them to be reefed. So it's possible that companies will just remove them because they don't think they'll. Yeah, but if they don't think they'll be allowed to, or they don't have that ecological evidence that they could leave it.
What's really holding it up then? What's the main? Is it just policies?
I think it's policies, and someone has to be the first. So someone has to be the first one to go through that process and really test the system to see what's allowed. So when it's happened in the Bass Strait and we see it there, chances are we'll see it happening more here.
Right. Is it just being held back politically? Is that the last final step?
I don't think it's even politically. It's more just regulations that make it difficult because it's not as explicitly allowed. You're kind of challenging those regulations and you need to build a case to say this is why we should leave it.
But it sounds like there's all these positive, like the case is it not built already by this
I would
research?
think so.
Yeah.
There isn't as much research in WA, unfortunately. There have been a few groups working on it here, but nothing compared to what's been done in the Gulf of Mexico or California or the North Sea. We're really far behind in terms of the environmental research into this here.
If you had unlimited money and time, what would you work on? Sorry, I realized I just said goodbye. Then I was like, no, sort of had a second wind of going, I want to know what this is. Yeah.
That's a really interesting question. In terms of rigs to reefs, I think I'd love to do a full study that was tagging as well. So figuring out if these species are spending a lot of their time there or if they're moving to other areas, looking at everything from invertebrates to megafauna around the platforms is something I'm really interested in. As I mentioned, the whales and turtles that spend a lot of time there, just why are they coming there? Are they diverting their normal routes to spend time around these platforms? Is it because of currents? And just looking at that kind of broader approach to consider everything that we can. And then look at a decommissioned platform. Yeah.
Yeah. And the first one will be in the Bass Strait, hopefully.
Yeah.
Awesome. No, well, this has been great. It's been so cool. And you've got an Instagram that people can check out. And I see you put up some videos as well. Is it your personal one and also the Marine Futures?
Yes. So I'm trying to set one up for just sharing videos of work, which is Sean in the Sea.
Yes.
underscores in between. And then Sea Marine Futures is our lab Instagram where we post our work from all over the world, from the Arctic to French Polynesia to Australia.
Awesome. Yeah, I've seen quite a few of those videos. There's one recently of the shark coming up to your bruvs. That was pretty cool.
Yes, yeah. And that's the nice thing about bruvs. It's really good for communications as well.
Yeah. Do you reckon you'll put up that video of the cuttlefish crawling
Yeah,
along?
I actually will, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a really cool one.
I would love to see that and share that out. So, yeah, awesome. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Paramount importance.